Rolling now.
Does the conception of race erase your cultural identity? Have you felt that you have had to sacrifice one for the other?
That's interesting. I would say not so much, because among Asian Americans, a lot of our cultures overlap. Like, we celebrate Lunar New Year's all at the same time. Our foods are very similar. At one point, other than Japan, China's conquered every single one of those countries. So there's a lot of overlap. So when you look at Asian people, it's not that different, because the diaspora, I think, is a little bit more recent. I feel like for Black people, it's a little bit more difficult, because diaspora happened earlier and you can come from different parts of the world and still be Black. While for Asia, the diaspora is a little bit more recent, so everybody does actually come from Asia. And growing up, we all had similar experiences. Like, we all had to go to like Japanese school, Chinese school. Like, we all ate every single Asian type cuisine. We all use chopsticks, so it's not that difficult. Yeah, so not so much. Not so much for me.
So I often think about like the boxes that you have to check on government forms or like in school when you're applying to things, or the end of grade test, whatever. And I never knew what to do with those boxes, because it's like, you know, they're a little bit more varied now, but it used to be like Asian, Black, white, and like that's really basic. And I don't fit into any one of those. And so like there's a white side, and then there's also an Asian side. But if I check Asian, I feel really weird, because I'm like, when we say Asian, we don't think about South Asian. Yeah, exactly. So I think when I have to like put myself in a box of race, I feel really erased. Actually, I do. Like, I feel like I don't exist, because I'm South Asian, but we don't think of that, right? And there's no box for mixed. I mean, there's like starting to be more, depending on what it is, but I feel like I've had to kind of choose. If it's a government form, like, depending on what it's for, I'm not going to put white, because then I don't exist in that way. And so then I'm going to put Asian, but then I feel like it's like a totally different conception of what I really am. And so I feel like I'm kind of like sacrificing my true experience of who I really am for this little tiny box that doesn't actually represent me at all.
And it's interesting, because I feel like in this situation, like, my view is more of the majority view, in that when people do say Asian, they think of East Asians, right? So when I look at the box, I'm like, easy, done, right? But it's the same thing that when we look at other people whose races are more majority than ours, we're like, this must be how their lives are. They just look at it, it's very straightforward, and for us, it's a little bit more nuanced. So yeah, it's like kind of a miniature of a larger thing that we usually see.
Totally. Yeah. All comes down to like dominant, like what's the dominant narrative? Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay. So my question for you, which I thought was very interesting because you're mixed heritage, is have you ever felt blanketed by another group's cultural identity? And if so, how did you deal with it? And again, was there a feeling of erasure or belonging when you felt like a stronger pull from either one of your cultural backgrounds?
Yeah, I think it's really dependent on when in my life I've been thinking about this. So growing up, you know, I didn't think that I was different than anyone else. I just thought that everyone had a mixed house. And then it wasn't until I was in elementary school and my mom, the Cajun person, came to my school and like wore shalwar kameez, like traditional Pakistani clothes, and like made this Pakistani food, and was like teaching the kids in my school about this other part of my culture. And I was like, wait, what? Not everyone does this? This is weird and different? Hold on. You know, like all of a sudden I realized I was different. And so then, like, after that, and I grew up in like rural North Carolina, and so I had to kind of like choose in which moment was I being seen as American by my peers, or like if I was going to talk about something different or other, was I all of a sudden being seen as brown and very like exotic in that way? And then like also with my father's family, you know, I really felt like I didn't actually fit in. I didn't speak the language, and I like have way more like American nuances in my mannerisms and in how I act in the world than Pakistani ones, and so like I just didn't feel like I fit in there either, and so I just like had to just kind of choose in which moment how am I going to perform in the moment, like what is expected of me, and like how do I feel true to myself in that moment.
I think it's a benefit in that you have, like we talked about before, different tools that you can use, like different lenses that you can look at different situations, but at the same time you always have to go through that decision making process. And I mean, one thing you brought up, like when you travel, yes, there's definitely do I approach stuff as with my, more Chinese American side, or do I approach it with the American side? But also I think at work, sometimes that happens as well. So I work in a very corporate environment, and I think sometimes it's like when you're younger, you tend to censor yourself maybe a little bit for social pressure, or maybe you act out. I acted out. But at work, like there's like a different set of behaviors that you're supposed to have, and then race and culture becomes like a very interesting thing there, because it's a little bit more high stakes in that you don't want to cause ripples, because you fight with your friends, you get to get bed with your parents, so it's all good, right? But if you fight with your coworkers, it's like a completely different thing. So you're very careful about not causing conflict, not making people feel uncomfortable, and that adds like a layer of censoring that is kind of very interesting to have, because you're adults, you understand your identity. You're like, well, I want to lead with this identity, but sometimes you can't choose to do that when you're sitting in a boardroom or like sitting in a meeting with a bunch of other people.
And also, the censoring is really, like, I find myself doing all these algorithms and algebra to, like, figure out in the moment which kind of code switching I need to do, and, like, what is being expected of me in this moment, and what are going to be the consequences of acting in this one way or the other way. And so, like, in work settings, especially when people expect something of me, like, oh, where are you from? And they're asking this "where are you from" question, and I'm like, Louisiana. Like, and they're like, really, where are you from? Like, South Louisiana. Like, I'm not going to, like, give you more than that in this moment, because right now I'm focused on like my meeting. You know, like I just like what am I supposed to do?
And we're not making this a topic. Like we just choose like we're here to do this job, let's do this job. We're not here to discuss my identity.
Right, and how all of a sudden I'm different or other, like because you've decided that. Yeah.
I agree with it.
All right. Cool. So the next question is about relationships. Is there ever any pressure to date or marry within your culture?
Yeah, I think there definitely is, because I think for our parents, they see our otherness differently, because like we talked about before, being out of the culture is a very natural thing for them, because that's just who they are. So I think for my parents, they would be like, maybe you should think about this. They would have some opinions, but they've been very progressive in kind of letting me do whatever I want. But I find for myself, like I tend to look for people that have similar experiences growing up, where they don't have to be the same culture as me, but they have to understand like the otherness, right? They have to understand that like if somebody makes like classic rock comments, I'm not going to know what those references are, because my parents didn't grow up listening to classic rock, therefore I didn't grow up listening to classic rock, so don't laugh at me if I don't know who these bands are. Like you hum the song, I'll know it because it's everywhere, but you say the lyrics, you say the title, like I'm not going to know it. Having that ability to empathize with it is pretty important, because it does really shape how you look at a lot of things.
Yeah, totally. So for me, it's really complicated. Relationships are really complicated. So I'm queer and have been out as queer for a long time, except to my father.
Ooh.
And so I don't know what he knows. We haven't talked about it. But so he married someone outside of his culture. He married a Cajun woman in the U.S., and so he already sort of like transgressed that boundary. So growing up, there wasn't like a ton of pressure around having, an arranged marriage or like someone that he knew or anything like that. But there was, as I got older, this like, oh, I'll introduce you to my family's friend, and now we, like starting to talk about it, and I just sort of like backed away and like, nope, we're not gonna talk about it. We're not gonna talk about it.
Yeah.
But there wasn't a lot of pressure in that way. But there's been a lot of fear for me around being out to him and his family, because there's this fear of like not being accepted, and I don't have any basis for this fear. It's simply within me. Like I don't have any idea if they would actually accept me or not accept me,
because they've already gone through that
with him. Exactly. And so to give him the benefit of the doubt, maybe it would be totally fine, but I have this fear of like, since I'm already sort of outside of his culture as it is, since I was raised here and I have a white mom, I like fear sort of being pushed out even more.
That would be interesting if your mom felt like if you expose all these things to your dad's family, would they say like, oh, it's the Americanness coming in? Like, do you think they'll say stuff
I think that there's, with other things there have been in my life, right? Like you do this because you're born in the U.S. and you don't know the right way, kind of thing.
It'll be interesting to see how your mom feels about that.
Yeah, I'd be curious to talk to her about it. Yeah, and she's been amazing. And what you said about just finding someone who sort of like lives in the other and being able to identify with them. So my partner is also white, and sometimes that's really hard in some ways, being a person of color with a white person. But some ways that's really great, because my partner is trans, and so they have an experience of living in the other and like transgressing other boundaries in a way. And so we've really connected over that, and it's like, I think it would be really hard for me to be in an interracial relationship with someone who didn't also understand like what it's like to be seen as other and outside of like the dominant narrative. Yeah,
I also agree, because I don't think it's like, oh, you don't eat the same food as I do. That's okay. I can eat whatever, I can get used to eating other stuff. It's the do you understand the feeling part that's always really important.
Yeah,
so
totally.
awesome. Cool.
Yeah. All right.
I think we're good.
Guess that's it. Was that too long enough?
No, that's perfect.